This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zachariason.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zachariason, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at numberfire.com, and this is episode 326 of the Late Round Podcast, one of the many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. Last week was a good one for the matchup show. On Thanksgiving, Anthony Miller came through with a big day, Jaden Graham was a tight end one, and Russell Gage ended up being a good deeper play. And then over the weekend, Jared Goff had a big day, Sammy Watkins didn't, Robert Woods was indeed undervalued, Miles Sanders was great, and so was Carson Wentz. The biggest miss last week was Deshaun Watson. That was a big miss. But overall, I'd say it was one of the best matchup shows of the year. So hopefully the momentum can continue into week 14. But I'm an analytics person, so I'm not supposed to believe in momentum. Before looking at players I'm higher and lower on versus the consensus this week, I want to let you guys know that we're going streaking. No, not that kind of streaking. From December 9th to December 21st, FanDuel is rewarding you for going on a winning streak. All you have to do is finish in the top 50% of an eligible contest to build your streak. If you do, great, your streak continues. If you don't, your streak ends and you can start a new streak the next day. At the end of the contest, you'll be rewarded based on the length of your longest streak. And the user with the longest streak out of everyone will win the grand prize. For more details, visit FanDuel.com or download the FanDuel app today. Eligibility restrictions apply. Baker Mayfield is the QB 17 on Fantasy Pros this week, and that's too low. When adjusted for strength of opponent, Mayfield's still been just a barely below average fantasy quarterback this year. I know it sounds crazy because he's averaging under 14 points per game, but that's how tough the schedule's been for the Browns. Now they get Cincinnati. The Bengals were good against Sam Darnold last week, but over the larger sample, they've allowed 2.8 more points than their opponent's season-long averages per game, meaning we should expect a bump for a quarterback in this type of matchup. It's also good that Andy Dalton's back, because the opposing offenses can't play it conservatively after getting a lead against Cincinnati. Hopefully that means the Browns won't just run the ball to a potential victory. Now, as a traditional streamer, I like Ryan Fitzpatrick the most this week. I actually like him more than Jacoby Brissett, and Jacoby Brissett's ranked ahead of him. But as I alluded to on this week's 15 Transaction Show, the Dolphins haven't been all that bad offensively since Fitzpatrick returned as starter. And Fitz now has 3 top 7 performances over his last 5 games. Since coming back as starter, he's averaged 18.8 points per game. The Jets are an above-average matchup for opposing quarterbacks in fantasy as well, and they'll likely be without Jamal Adams. So it makes them an even better matchup. Now, if you want a really deep play, I'm talking really deep, I don't totally mind Duck Hodges. When adjusted for strength of opponent, the Cardinals have allowed opposing quarterbacks to score 6.8 more points per game than their season-long averages. That's the highest mark in the league. And the Steelers are on the road in this game as slight favorites. That means that the game is projected to be close. But it also means that the Steelers may not be able to play things all that conservatively and just run the ball because they might see a negative game script. It's likely that you won't need to play someone like Duck Hodges, but I do think that he's got at least a little bit of upside this week. Tom Brady was the QB6 last week, and he had his best performance since week 2, which was when Antonio Brown was on the team against the Dolphins. But if you watch that game, then you saw a pretty mediocre Tom Brady, and you saw a player who scored a lot of fantasy points in garbage time. This week against Kansas City looks like a decent matchup on paper, and it's not horrible by any means, but I still worry about Brady. We know that New England is great at game planning against weaknesses, and the weakness against Kansas City is their rush defense. So it wouldn't be shocking at all to see the Patriots go with a ground and pound approach and try to make this game not be a shootout. That in turn would hurt Tom Brady. Even strictly from a fantasy perspective, Kansas City's been a pretty average opponent. In terms of schedule-adjusted points allowed, they're 16th in the NFL. Like I said, they're average. And we know that this season, Brady hasn't been a special fantasy quarterback. So I'm not as into him as the rankers are. Josh Allen's another player who's a risky start. We know the upside is there in any game because of what he can do with his legs. And he's been a much better passer this year than he was last year. But Baltimore is a rough matchup. Since they got Marcus Peters in week 7, quarterbacks have averaged just 9 points per game against the Ravens. Those quarterbacks that have faced the Ravens since then include Russell Wilson, Tom Brady, Deshaun Watson, Jared Goff, and Jimmy Garoppolo. It's just straight up a tough matchup. The game doesn't have a super high over-under, and Buffalo's a fairly big underdog, giving them the 5th lowest implied total on this week's slate. Like I said, Allen's upside is always there because of his rushing, but this is objectively a very difficult matchup. I got a fun tweet from someone on Wednesday that said, "Shut up about Aaron Jones for just 1 week." And I would do that if the way that people viewed Jones and teammate Jamal Williams wasn't so out of whack. I think Jones is a great play this week. If you have Aaron Jones, you should play him. But like I talked about on my 10 Trends show yesterday, the gap between Jones and Williams shouldn't be as massive as it is. Of course, the outcome could say differently, but this is a consistent thing that's been happening. Jamal Williams is not getting enough love for what he's been doing in fantasy football. Since returning from his concussion in week 6, Williams has averaged almost 15 PPR points per game. Over that time, from week 6 until now, Williams has been the RB13 in fantasy football. But he's the RB27 this week against a Washington team that's below average at stopping running backs. And that Washington team is a huge underdog. That means the Packers could lean on their running backs even more than usual. So I like Aaron Jones, but I don't understand the big gap between Jones and Jamal Williams. There's a chance that we see a decent performance from Devonta Freeman this week. During his return in week 13, Freeman saw 74% of Atlanta's running back rushes and a 10.6% target share. Both are good numbers. He didn't do a whole lot against a good Saints front, but he gets Carolina this week, and they've been awful against the run. We saw Washington go nuts on them last week, and over the season, they've now allowed the third most rushing yards and the most fantasy points to opposing running backs. So Freeman is actually a decent RB2 this week in PPR formats. Even though it sounds like Dalvin Cook is going to play this week, Alexander Mattison could still be considered as a flex option. This is sort of the same logic that was used with Darrell Williams last week, who was good before suffering an injury. But the Vikings are big favorites this week. They could score a lot of points, and Mattison may see some work as a result. If the Vikings get ahead, it's easy to see them resting Dalvin Cook and using more Mattison. It's more of a feel take rather than a data-driven one, but I think it's logical at least. Tevin Coleman and Ronald Jones are two guys who are kind of in the same bucket for me this week. And that bucket is, how can you really trust this guy in the fantasy football playoffs? Tevin Coleman's coming off a game where Raheem Mostert ended up seeing way more work, and Coleman's now averaged just a little over 8 PPR points per game over his last 5. In a bad matchup against the Saints, I don't know how you can trust him as anything but a desperation type flex play. And then with Ronald Jones, we saw what a missed blitz pickup did to his fantasy value last week. He ended up being completely irrelevant. Bruce Arians did say on Wednesday that they want to get him going this week, but I have no idea how you can just blindly trust that. The matchup's below average for Jones, too. The Colts have allowed 2.4 points below expectation to opposing team running backs this year, meaning they've been a below average matchup this year for fantasy backs. So that, compounded with the fact that Jones just seems far less predictable than we thought just a week ago, makes him tough to play this week. Alshon Jeffrey's averaged 15.3 fantasy points per game in contests where he hasn't been hurt this year, where he hasn't left the game. You guys would all agree that Courtland Sutton's been a usable fantasy asset this year, right? Well, that's been his weekly average as well. And this week, the Eagles get the Giants. The Giants are bad defensively. Only the Bucs have allowed more points to opposing wide receivers, and New York's given up 6 top 24 performances to wideouts over their last 3 games. Philly's got a high implied team total, and that's what makes me feel like Alshon's undervalued this week. He's ranked outside the top 24. Another veteran wideout that I like a lot this week is Emmanuel Sanders. He was finally off the injury report at the end of last week, and against Baltimore, he played 98% of San Francisco's snaps. That's significant because his highest snap rate over his previous 3 games was just 66%. Meanwhile, even though Sanders didn't do much for fantasy purposes last week, he had a 28.6% target share. He was being targeted. And San Francisco gets the Saints this week, a team that hasn't done well against the slot. In fact, no team has allowed a higher rate of targets to go to slot receivers this season, and only the Cardinals have allowed more slot receptions. Sanders, according to Pro Football Focus, has played 40% of his snaps from the slot with the 49ers this year. So it's a good matchup for him. If T.Y. Hilton doesn't go this week, and it doesn't sound promising right now, Zach Pascal is not a bad option. I talked about him on the 15 Transaction Show earlier in the week, but without Hilton, Pascal's seen a 22% target share in this Colts offense. They really don't have alternatives right now, and they're facing a defense that's been completely atrocious against wide receivers this year. Get this, guys. Tampa Bay has allowed 11 points per game above expectation this year to opposing wide receivers, meaning team wide receivers have scored, on average, 11 more points against the Bucs than their season-long averages. For context, the team in second place, or the second worst team, is Miami. They've allowed 7 points above expectation. That's how bad Tampa Bay is, and that's why Zach Pascal is a good play. Now, one wide receiver I think is overvalued this week is DJ Chark. We know he has a good ceiling, but he's also ranked at wide receiver 10 this week. He's hit that mark just twice over his last 7 games. Chark's averaging just a little over 13 points per game during this split, and that's with a 30-point outing. And he gets the Chargers this week. The cornerback matchup against Casey Hayward should be tough, and the Chargers have the 3rd best schedule-adjusted defense against fantasy receivers this year. So I think Chark should be more of a lower-end wide receiver 2 rather than a lower-end wide receiver 1. And then there's Tyrell Williams. He's ranked ahead of Marvin Jones, Zach Pascal, and Emmanuel Sanders, and I'd be playing all 3 over him this week. The matchup isn't that bad, but that really hasn't mattered for Williams of late. Since returning from his injury in Week 8, Williams has just a 16% target share, and he's provided fantasy managers with just 8 PPR points per game. He hasn't been reliable at all, so I don't know why we should just assume that it changes this week, especially with other options out there. We can write off Tyler Higbee's performance last week as him just facing the Cardinals. We know the Cardinals are terrible against tight ends. But be aware of 2 things. According to PFF, Higbee still ran the 9th most routes at tight end last week. And then this week, he gets Seattle. That's the team that ranks 2nd in adjusted fantasy points allowed to tight ends. It's the 2nd best matchup. So if Gerald Everett is out again, Higbee's in play. And if Everett's in, then he makes for a riskier play because he's coming off that injury. Mike Gesicki, though, to me is the safest option that might be on your waiver wire. Not only is Jamal Adams looking unlikely to play, but he's now seen a 17% target share over his last 5 games, and he's had 3 top 5 performances during this stretch. He's been involved in the Dolphins' offense that's been better with Ryan Fitzpatrick, like I alluded to earlier. And he should be a tight end 1 this week, or at least that's how you should be viewing him. The Houston Texans were the 15 transactions defense this week, and they're still the best traditional streamer. They're big favorites, they're facing an inexperienced quarterback, and they're at home. Even though they've been worse without J.J. Watt, they did show a little bit more life last week, and they should be fine in Week 14. But if you want a defense that is almost definitely on your waiver wire, you could go with the Arizona Cardinals. Now, this is a very deep play, so don't go playing the Cardinals over safer options. But Arizona's given us 3 usable performances over their last 6 games, and like I talked about earlier with Duck Hodges, we shouldn't just assume the Steelers see a positive game script in this game. Arizona's at home, and it's not like Hodges is some experienced quarterback. And defenses against Pittsburgh over their last 5 games, here's how those defenses have played. They've been the defense 6, 3, 3, 13, and 19. They've actually had pretty high floors, and that's with Pittsburgh winning 4 of those 5 games. If there's a negative game script for the Steelers, it could help Duck Hodges, like I talked about earlier. It could make him a more fantasy-relevant quarterback. But we also know that that could go south, and it would really benefit the Cardinals' defense. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet subscribed to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Thanks, everyone. Be back in your ears tomorrow with the last episode of the week, the Mailbag episode.